Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Petr Klimes. He's head of a laboratory of ecology and evolution of social insects. And right now he's in the Czech Republic. And we're going to talk about his research on arboreal ant communities in New Guinea. So, Petr, thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, tell me about your research and your fieldwork.
Yeah, so my laboratory focuses mostly on tropical ants, although we do also some research on ants in temperate zone as well. And I have several colleagues, so the topics are quite broad. For my part, I'm interested mostly, as you said in introduction, in canopy ants. That means the ants which live in tropical trees, like in the tops, in the branches, and then in crowns of trees. But some of my colleagues, they do research also on biogeography on ants, so how species spread across the islands in Pacific in particular, and about their molecular and evolutionary history. And we also do research on interaction of ants with other animals, especially herbivores, insects, or birds, plants, and so on.
Oh, let's start with that. What kind of animals do ants interact with, and in what situations?
Yeah, it's quite interesting topic because, ants are social animals. They live in nests and colonies. But unlike bees, which are pollinators, or wasps, which mostly predate, ants are more diverse in interaction. So some are predators, so some are omnivores, which means that they eat all kind of food. And some are more specialized to honeydew, like sugars or plant exudates from nectaries and from flowers, like nectar and honeydew from aphids. And in tropics, they are more diverse than in temperate zone because some species are really specialized predators and some are really broad in diet. So that's quite interesting question. I'm also looking to differences between ground ants and arboreal ants because the ants which live in soil in the ground are mostly predators, but those which are in trees are more interacting with honeydew insects like aphids.
Well, you know how anemones in the sea will let clownfish, go between them, or sharks will allow some, little fish to clean their teeth. Are there any examples of ants that other animals allow to crawl on them, to eat stuff off of them, or are there any relationships like that?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's not really like that, but what is quite widespread in ants is kind of different relationship, like parasitism or some kind of symbiosis. So there are a lot of cases where the ants are interacting with each other, between species. Some species are parasites of other ants, that they steal their larvae, or they are slave-making ants. But there are also symbiotic relationships where two ants, two species are going quite well together, and they are actually kind of profitable from each other. But then you have also a lot of ranges of other insects or arthropods, invertebrates, which also are kind of in symbiotic or parasitic relationship with ants, living in their nests, or stealing their food. And it really ranges from symbiosis, sometimes even to predation and to parasitism. A good example are, for example, caterpillars of blue-winged butterflies, which are quite well known for this kind of relationship, where some caterpillars are just giving some honeydew, some nectars or attractants to ants, but some others, they are actually brought to the nest and they start to eat the caterpillars, the larvae of ants, and they start to be predators actually.
Are there any where two kinds of ants or ants and another type of creature will literally share nest space? Or do they keep that, no one's allowed into the nest unless it's always a bad reason that another creature's in the nest? Like, is the symbiosis ever strong enough where even in the nest environment, ants will hang out with other creatures?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Actually, one big part of my research in current is like looking how species coexist in tropical forests. Because what's really interesting and cool is that even in tropical forests where you have like really a lot of species, like we documented something like over 100 species of ants in trees just in a hectare. But what's interesting, like a lot of these species are rare and some are really super common. And sometimes these like species which are more rare can actually nest quite close by to this dominant, super dominant ants, but only some of them. And one of my colleague, he like documented the cases, like it's called actually parabiosis, where the species are kind of tolerating each other, and in some cases, not in Papua New Guinea, but in Borneo, for example, there is a documented case where two unrelated species are even sharing nest space, or they share the trails where they carry the food and so on. So it's a bit exceptional, but it can exist in tropics especially.
Yeah, what's the most amazing relationship you've seen ants have with another creature? What was it? What was it like?
I mean, like, I really admire this relationship, like, with this honeydew insects. Like, in temperate zone, you have aphids, and that's also fascinating, but it's kind of easy to spot. You just see ants which are climbing the plants, and they see the aphids, they protect them, and then they carry the honeydew back to the nest. But in the tropics, there is kind of like cryptic symbiosis, which I was really surprised to find how it's common in tropical canopies, which is with scale insects. Like, scale insects are kind of fascinating insects related to aphids, but they look like flat, non-moving kind of structures. You wouldn't even say that it's insect, and they live like either on the plant, on the bark, but in the system I worked in, I found out that most are actually living inside of hollow branches, and there are like colonies of ants which are full of these scale insects and larvae, and they live together. And scale insects actually provide them sugars, and it has been hypothesized that that's the reason why these canopy ants are so super dominant, so super common. Their biomass is actually higher than of the other insects in canopy of trees, and this is because they are probably boosted by these honeydew and sugars provided by this cryptic symbiosis inside of trees, which is quite fascinating.
So what does that mean? The ants will go onto certain plants or trees deliberately to get aphids onto them and then take the aphids somewhere? Or like, can you explain a little more detail of how it works?
Yeah, it's actually not so well known how these symbionts like distribute, but it's quite like if is it really tight symbiosis, like either with aphids in the soil, like with some ants in temperate zone, like Lasius genus. So they are like clones, and they are even carried like sometimes even with queen. Like if is it really like strict symbiosis, there are known cases where queen, which is flying off the nest to establish the new nest, is actually carrying the young symbiont with it. Yeah, something similar do also other ants in South America, which has symbiosis with fungi, and they also carry like a mycelium of fungi. And when they establish the colony, they can establish a new garden of the fungi. And something similar was documented also with some aphids or scale insects. But that's in the cases of really tight symbiosis. If is it more commonly like some kind of facultative symbiosis, they just like visit the aphids on plants, and they just protect them and breed the colonies like externally outside of the nest. And in case of my system, we actually don't know how it works because these branches are closed, and the scale insects are already there. So it's not really known how they are distributed. And there are a lot of species of ants which sometimes breed the same species of scale insects, sometimes different. So it's like a bit specialized, but not too much. So it's actually very unknown, I would say, in these canopies, how it works exactly.
Well, when you do field study, do you hang out with ants, or like what do you do? What does a field study look like?
Yeah, it's quite heavy work and kind of adventurous. So I joined the group of Professor Novotny, who established a research station in Papua New Guinea which is like east half of New Guinea Island, and it's a democratic country which used to be Australian colony in 1960s. And even though that it's like democratic country with parliament and kind of like a good like political system similar to Australia, it's still a rural country, and most of the land is tropical rainforest, and most of the people are still sustainable farmers. So what we did after establishment of this research station was actually that we started to work with villagers and with local landowners, because what's also exceptional in the country compared to other tropical countries is that the people own the land. So actually, if you want to enter the forest, you have to really work with villagers. So it's kind of symbiosis between researchers coming from Europe and US and working with local so-called scientists, like parataxonomists, who are like trained assistants helping us with the research as employees. And then the other people we work with are actually really like rural villagers who know the forest and who can allow us to access the forest and help us with the research, usually for like profit that we employ them. And it's kind of interesting story because it helps to protect also the forest, because the long-term activity of researchers was successful in last like 20 years there to establish conservational areas with the people and save quite a lot of forest before from logging actually. So it's quite interesting.
Well, I just spoke to a researcher today. I'm doing a series on ants and bees. The ant guy, he said that they're able to stick a color-coded piece of tiny paper to the thorax of ants, and then using infrared or other spectroscopy, they can literally see them in their nest and watch them and follow them. Do you know if there's any way in the field of tagging ants that works for a period of time where you can, follow their activity and their motion and where they go?
Oh yeah, I have to say I don't have so much experience with this because, in our work in tropical forest, we don't have so much time or so much tools to really observe like individual ants or inside the nest. Like our work is really kind of basic in the sense that there is so little known that when I started to do research, rather than to do some like kind of really advanced technique like you described, we started with something really simple. Like we worked with villagers who are felling the forest, and we actually kind of dissected the forest with chainsaw and axes for the first time, which was just like a tiny piece of forest. And at the same time, we protect and help protect the forest in the surrounding. And by doing that, we could actually for the first time to really see like how many species are there, where they nest, and what is their like basic ecology and relations. What are the rare species, common species, how they are aggressive. You can of course observe them live and how they are aggressive and so on. But to really like kind of peer inside of the nest, that's quite impossible in the moment in tropics. I guess very difficult.
What's the strangest or most amazing type of ant or situation you've seen?
Most amazing ants. Yeah, there are many. It's like, I think what's very fascinating about tropical ants is that they are so diverse in structure, like how they look like. Not only what they do, as I described, like from predators to like these omnivores ants or honey eaters, but also how they look like. It's quite associated with their ecology. So, when you look at the ants, like here in Czech Republic or in temperate US, they're also fascinating creatures, but they look kind of similar. Like everybody can recognize what is the ant, and they might be kind of boring, unlike like butterflies or beetles to people who are not really like researchers or entomologists. But in tropics, they are so diverse. Like you can have species just in size. You can have species in litter, like on the ground, in leaf litter, which are just like 1 millimeter big, and they have like triangle-shaped heads with really sharp, long mandibles, and they catch springtails or some really small insects in leaf litter who are like really fastly moving. And you can have also like ants like in Borneo in trees, like ant which is actually called like gigas, like a really big ant, which is 3-4 centimeters, and it's dimorphic. It has really big soldiers who are protecting the colony, and then smaller individuals who are more dealing for the food for colony.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
And they are really different. They have just different heads, different mandibles, different food resources. They are really big. So it's quite fascinating how actually diverse in structure the ants in tropics are.
So do you feel like you're just in the early stages of even finding these ant colonies and understanding the basics of them? Or are there any ants that you're doing advanced research on to really figure out, the nuances of them?
I actually just obtained new project, my proposal has been funded, so we are looking forward. Hopefully it will be possible when situation about COVID will improve, that we can travel next year in summer to Papua New Guinea and establish new projects. And because I know now quite a lot about these previously unknown communities, we already know what lives in forests, and we met the ants, we know how big territories they have and which species are common and which rare, as I described. What we aim next to is actually look at a little bit to more detail to some interspecies interaction and biology, especially we are interested to see if these ants could be used kind of like a model, how climate change and habitat change, forest change is influencing the communities. We plan to put to the forest a lot of artificial bamboo nests and let them occupy. And then we plan even kind of translocate these nests between different forest types, nice forest to plantation and back, or between high elevation to low elevation, which we hope could be kind of interesting manipulative experiments to actually really work with live colonies and to see how they react to these big changes today, which have never been actually done before in ants. So it's kind of cool and a bit risky experiment maybe in the same time, but we hope to succeed. We already tested some of these methods before, and it looks that it could work.
Could you, in a tropical area, take a small animal that had been killed and put it on the floor, of the forest, and put cameras on it and watch it over 24 or 48 hours and see if ants come and what they do? Maybe maybe you could act as bait to lure out ants that you want to study.
Yeah, interesting. Actually, this is kind of really side topic. There are not so many researchers in ants, I think, who are working on something like that you described. But in a conference, I actually seen that some people in Japan, they have some special ant which is really active in carcasses of animals. And I have one colleague here who is studying something similar in temperate zone in Czech Republic. But mostly the ants are doing the job as well sometimes, but I think there are other creatures, flies and some specialized beetles who are, I think, getting rid of the carcass more effectively than ants. But in tropics, what we actually use, or what's common methods to actually monitor the ants in tropical forests and attract them, is actually putting the tuna baits on trees and on the ground. It sounds a bit funny to likes because, it's just tuna bait from can. And you can put a little bit tuna with oil, and it's terribly attractive to ants. So it's kind of standardized method. If you want to see what are common ants in an unknown site, you just put these tuna baits, and you can observe how ants are coming to the meat and how they fight each other. What is their kind of time succession in the baits, and it's quite useful method to observe some behavior between ants as well.
I don't know. What are you hoping to figure out about ants? Any big themes, or are you just exploring the world of ants and seeing what's out there?
Yeah, it's not that we would be just exploring randomly. We of course have some scientific scheme. So what are our main interests is that we use ants as a model organism, as a whole community, to use them to observe some changes in insect communities in reaction to quite a hot topic today, how insects, here ants, are reacting, for example, to elevational changes and to climatic changes. So for the first time in Papua New Guinea, we explored all the ants on vegetation and on the ground along Mount Wilhelm, which is like the biggest mountain on the east of Ireland, like over 4,000 meters above sea level. And it's covered almost whole by pristine rainforest, which is very unique today because most of these big mountains in tropics are already damaged, and they usually have in lowlands just plantations and secondary forests. But we had this unique opportunity to actually see how natural communities are changing in such a big mountain summit. And apart of these elevational changes, before for my PhD thesis, I was in particular interested just in lowlands, how communities change from secondary forest, which grows after 10 years when the forest has been felled, and how the communities of ants differ from primary forest. And how invasive species, we are also quite interested how invasive species which are not native in these forests are spreading, and what is their role and how they compare to native species, which is quite also interesting. So these are kind of like main topics we studied in ants, a part of canopies.
Out of the places that you've been to study ants, I don't know, are some places more conducive versus others? Like, is Papua New Guinea a great place to do it? And other places are kind of like, eh? Like, what makes a good place to study ants, in your opinion, and why?
Yeah, so, I mean, Papua New Guinea is a fascinating place to study ants because, I was one of the really few people to actually starting to look at the ants in canopies and in trees. There has been no work. I started in 2007, so it's not so long ago. And only primary work there was by a famous biologist at Wilson in 1960s. And since the time, really not much. So that was kind of surprising for me. And the country is fabulous for insect and plant research because there is so high endemism and high diversity, that it's just incredible. But at the same time, it's not easy to work there really. It's like really place difficult to get. It's one of the most expensive tropical countries, which a lot of people actually don't know. So, it's not so easy to work there, and without working with local people, we couldn't do that. But I think it's kind of less interesting, but it's still somewhat interesting to study ants even just here in Europe. It's just a bit more boring because a lot of stuff is already known. But recently I was starting just a small project with colleagues, which I found also quite interesting that there is like a network of new reserves around Czech Republic, where they fenced small areas of pastures and they breed there like wild cattle and bisons. And the idea is just to see how landscape, plants and biota, insects and butterflies, but also mammals are reacting actually to these grazing effects. And because I'm pretty much only one who is like doing this kind of research on ants, so in the country, I also joined the group and we started to monitor the ants in Czech Republic to see how they react to grazing. And it's kind of interesting because it quite varies between the sites, and we are just like kind of beginning to delve to the idea. So you can do interesting questions certainly on ant ecology and biology, even in Europe still. But of course in tropics is much more interesting. So some other sites we studied was also some research in Borneo, in Malaysia and Borneo, where like really different communities from Papua New Guinea, but we also studied ants in Panama and also in the temperate zone, like we could project which compare canopy ants between Virginia forest actually in US and Czech Republic and Papua New Guinea in recent. Because one of the interesting questions is also how these communities differ between tropics towards the temperate zone. In trees and where they nest in trees and how they are diverse, abundant, and so on.
Well, because, I mean, if you dig deep enough into the ground temperature is almost always the same. So are there any ants that live in colder climates? You said there's temperate ones, but do they tend to burrow into the ground more because of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, ants are quite omnipresent. You just don't get them, in Arctic zone and in Greenland, otherwise pretty much everywhere. But it's true. If you go, that's one of the interesting things that if you go to temperate zone, probably I think it's because of winter time, because the colonies cannot survive so easily through the winter. There are more ants which live just on the ground in the soil, but they don't build the colonies on trees so much. While in rainforests and tropics, it seems from our data and some other data from Amazonia, for example, and Borneo, that about half of ants species and probably also biomass is in trees and half is on the ground. So it's more like 50-50 and there is a high specialization. You got different ant species in canopies and different on the ground. While in temperate, the proportion of species which really live in canopies is pretty low. There are some specialized, but not so much. But still, we were actually surprised once we were using this kind of invasive technique that we follow the loggers and we really dissect the trees in Virginia. We actually were surprised that we also find quite some ants living in branches and in trees, which was kind of supposed to be quite rare. But once you really dissect piece of forest and you really look to these habitats which nobody looked before, you found out that there are still quite a lot of ants too. But it's less than in tropics, of course.
I was just about to ask you, and I laughed about ants migrating. They couldn't really migrate very far. But then I thought, I wonder if there's ants found, multiple feet down or hundreds of feet down, like in mines and things like that. I wonder if ants would migrate downwards. Do you know if there's any ants that, I have no clue if anyone's seen this, but do you think that ants could live on the surface and then when it gets to be winter, they could migrate way down, 6 feet down, 20 feet down and hang out there to survive the winter and then come back up?
Yeah, I think it's possible because, definitely, a lot of species are just nesting on the ground, and once it's warmer, they start to climb up the plants. But there are also species which have short-lived colonies, just in small twigs or even in some small nut, you can have a colony and so on. And those are usually short-lived, so I guess the ants are surviving in the ground, especially queens, and then once the temperature is warmer during the summer, you can have a really lot of new small colonies which are coming even to the vegetation. While in tropics, I think the colonies are surviving more, they can afford to survive multiple years because there is no winter. One really interesting question in current is reaction of ants to climate change, and that's more moving, not within locality, but people are more interested to test some effects if the ants as a species, as the ranges, if they can kind of move, if is it due to the climate. So there are different models and projections, and actually a lot of people who are studying climate change in insects, they also study ants because they are sensitive to temperature. But the data so far are rather anecdotal. There are not so many experiments, and a lot of this stuff is just on models. So we really don't know so much how these ants will react to climate change. What I found in my research, and what was kind of difficult to publish and surprising, that we actually found out that the ants which live in canopies in mountains are much less sensitive to to change of the forest. Even if the forest is young and not so nice and regrowth after felling, it got almost the same species and same diversity as the primary forest, which is completely different what is known from lowlands, where usually if you destroy the habitat, it has really dramatic effect on ants. We were quite surprised by this, but then I found out that we are just a first or second study in the world doing this, because all people study ants actually in lowlands, and nobody really climbs to the top of mountains to study ants and trees. So I don't know how general is it, but I suspect that actually the ants in mountain might be maybe less sensitive to changes than it's assumed by ecological theory, where actually a lot of people who are modeling say exactly the opposite, that the species who are endemic to mountains, they will not survive the climate change. So it's kind of interesting to see what will happen in future, because we still know actually quite few data points, not really so much on really observational data.
Do you know if there's ants on mountains or in caves? Are there ants that live in water somehow and can swim, or right near water?
Yeah, surely. I mean, there are no ants which would be like literally living underwater, right? Like in spiders, you have like this few spider species who can like catch the bubbles of air and they can really like live well like underwater. So this is not really case of ants, but still, like there are some documented really interesting cases which you I think can watch even like in Nature Geographic documentary. There are like few cases documented like that. So one is like this ant species which live in mangroves, like near the sea, where there is this big fluctuation of the sea level, and these ants actually found a way how to like build their nest in the way that the water is not easily coming in. And if it's coming in, they have like special like structure of these chambers in the nest, how they can like move quickly a little bit up so the water is not affecting them. That's like one famous example. Another one are invasive species, like there are a lot of studies on invasive ants called fire ants, Solenopsis invicta, which is actually very, very big pest species in US and also in Australia, New Zealand, and so on. We don't have it in Papua New Guinea actually, or in Czech Republic, but in US it's really problematic species. And what has been shown that these ants are so good in swimming and in collaboration with each other. So what they do is that if there is some water, they can actually swim across the stream by holding the legs of each other workers. So all like workers are kind of like interconnected, and they can float on the water as a small vehicle or something, and yeah, you can find even videos online about this, and it's quite interesting how some species can easily spread and become to be invasive because of this ability. But it's not common, I think. Only some species can do that.
What about in caves underground? Has anyone ever found ants or in mines?
Yeah, I don't know actually. In caves, I suspect in caves there will be not so many ants because there are some species of ants who are really blind and they don't need like really light. But those are species which live still like in forest or in some savannas, but they live deep underground. But about caves, I don't recall some species which would be really cave specialists in ants. But there are definitely other insects. So, especially some insects, I think it's because that in cave, if it's a really deep cave, there is really lack of nutrients and you have not so much to eat on. So what these specialized insects do is that they can specialize on eating of feces from bats, for example, or they can specialize on some carcasses which are brought by the stream inside to the cave. But for ants, I think this is kind of difficult because they need to establish like a good colony and some nesting place, and they need to raise the brood. So I think they might need more food, and it's more difficult for them to live in such caves, I think. But I might be not really right. Maybe there are some specialized to caves in ants as well, but I am not really sure.
Well, one time my dad used to work in New York City on like the 11th floor of a building, and I got Chinese food and I left it out, and we came back 2 hours later and there was like thousands of ants all over it. And I couldn't believe even in New York City up in a building that ants found it. So I figured like they're everywhere after that experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, I don't know which area you are based. It is a kind of warm place, like subtropical or kind
now
of.
I'm in Texas. Yeah, I'm in Austin, Texas
so
now.
so sure. Like in such area, like you can get many species. I'm sure there are these fire ants I just described about this water floating ability. They love like any biscuits and foods, and sometimes they enter the buildings. There are a lot of species of ants which can really like survive in buildings, and they can be kind of like with human. Actually, some colleagues in US, they even did research. I don't know if it was in New York or some another big city, but they even did research like that. They just left the biscuits in the offices and did exactly what you described by looking what kind of ants they actually get if they put some biscuit baits in the buildings in big cities in the US. And there was some scientific article about that, and it was quite interesting because you can see that it's not just one species, and some species are invasive, some not, and you can even document then by molecular technique how they spread across the US or something like that. So it's quite interesting, and in tropics it's also very common. Like even if you have air-conditioned laboratory, like in New Guinea or in Borneo, if you leave some food, you can be sure that in like 1-2 hours it will be just full of some ants.
What is the sensory apparatus of ants? Like humans don't seem to be particularly great about any sense. Dogs are great at smelling. What kind of senses do ants have, and which one is like their predominant sense?
Yeah, good question. Like ants, the really predominant sense in ants is actually chemical sense. They communicate by pheromones, and they have this kind of specialized cuticular carbones on their skin, on their cuticle. So they can smell if the other ant is not only the same species, but they can smell if is it really nestmate from the same colony. And a part of these chemical cues and leaving some pheromone trails which actually help them to find the food, because one ant can smell the food, finds the way, leave this tracking pheromone trail, and then the other can really easily find it. But there are also other communication skills. One of them is of course antennas. You can sometimes see it's even in kid movies that the ants are kind of touching each other with antennas, right? And they use it as kind of like communication, and they exchange also these chemical cues once they touch each other by antennas. And then they also have this fascinating feature, which is similar to bees, that they have this social stomach. So their stomach is actually divided to two parts. One is like bigger part called crop, and then there is a small pump, like a kind of a joint to the other part of stomach is the smaller one, which is actually the true stomach of the ant for his food. But most of the food the ant is keeping just in the social stomach, in the crop, in the front stomach, and it can actually like vomit actually like the food to the other nestmates. So if some ant is hungry, it can share the food with the others. If it has like full crop, it can share the food with the other who are hungry. I mean, and by doing this, it's believed that they also exchange the food quality and smell of the food, which also helps them to locate the resource. So there are like these multiple cues, like tactile, chemical, and also like kind of stomach cues, I would say, which they can use to actually locate the food and communicate about it.
So ants, again, sight is not a big sense for them. Hearing, I don't know, so how are their antennas used? You said chemosensing is very important, but what do their antennas do? Can they sense vibrations from the substrate they're walking on? It's kind of a proxy for hearing, or what do they do?
Yeah, I think so. They use the chemical communication and then tactile communication. So especially, a lot of ants are also covered by hairs. So they have different type of hairs on legs and also on the surface, and then also antennas and legs. And this is all like important to sense some vibration and texture also where they are running and so on. So it's not like only chemicals, but they don't have any like ability to really hear the sound, I think, as mammals, for example. So this is kind of similar to other insects like spiders and so on. But in some ants, but it's rather like minor part. Also, the eyes are very important. So especially ants which are living on plants, or they are living in deserts, in really dry areas where they have like little cues how to orient themselves like in the landscape to find the way back to the nest. They use also eyes, and there are some experiments with some ants living on trees or living in deserts, that they can actually use even the landmarks. They can memorize the landscape, and these ants are usually much more dependent on this vision communication than on chemical communication. But it's more like exception in terms of species number. But some ants can use eyes also as important There are some species where the eyes can cover most of the head actually. Some which look like, like dragonfly, like really ants with really big eyes also.
Have you looked at, have you sequenced ants in the lab, or have you looked at their microbiome? Do they tend to have an affinity for bacteria or for fungi because of where they are, and they're next to the ground and next to plants and roots and dirt and things like that? Like, is anyone looking at their microbiome?
Yeah, sure. Like microbiome is really hot topic today, and a lot of people do microbiome in insects. So there are definitely groups who do bacteria in ants. Like we are not doing this like in my lab, but we use also molecular technique. But in our case, because we are researching like this unknown bioentropics, we mostly use like barcoding of few genes, and we are building like just these phylogenetic trees, just this tree of life to actually see how species are different from each other and how they evolve. So it's kind of like more basic question, basic technique. But definitely there are like people who are doing also microbiome in ants. And what's interesting, what is probably most interesting discovery is, again, quite related to canopy ants actually, that there are some species, like a few groups of ants who live really in trees and in twigs, and some live also in symbiosis with plants. So like in acacia, where they really nest in the thorn of acacia, and the plant is providing some special food bodies to the ants. And in these cases of like plant mutualism, like plants and symbiosis interactions, or some ants which are living inside of trees, it has been found that they have really special bacteria which co-evolve with them. And it's also reason why some ants can eat just the honeydew from aphids, and just because it's really poor diet, really rich in sugars, but it doesn't contain so many amino acids. And it has been shown that some of these ants who have this special bacteria, they can actually compensate amino acid through these bacteria, because bacteria give them some essential amino acids on this sugar poor diet. So it's really tied to evolution. And recently there was even an article on an carpenter ant in Science, I think, where some American researcher show that these bacteria of genus Bohemia, they can even be transferred through the egg in a germ cell. So the bacteria are really like kind of part of the ant. It's like amazing symbiosis.
Yeah, that's very cool. I guess last question here. Do you know any ants that live amongst the roots of plants, or do they stick to the leaves and the bark and the stems and stuff, or are there any that hang out, near the root nodules and stuff?
Yeah, sure. Like that's one thing which I was actually focusing in Papua New Guinea in this canopy ants, was that I looked where the different ant species are nesting, and it's very diverse. So you can have species who are really kind of specialized to nesting in epiphytes. So that looks probably closest what you described, that the ant is living in the soil and in the roots under the epiphyte. So there's usually some fern, for example, living on the tree, and it has a lot of roots with a lot of soils, and the lot of ants are actually using this as a microhabitat, and they literally are just nesting and living, having small nests just inside of these rooty soil. But then there are other species who are specialized more to nesting to twigs, or nesting in bamboo stems, or some ants in tropics. They are kind of similar to wasps in the sense that they build own paper carton nest on leaves and on the bark. So it's quite diverse. And what I was looking at was that I found out that some species are not opportunistic not only in diet, but some can be really opportunistic in nesting. So there was one species in New Guinea which was quite widespread, and it can nest anywhere. So it can nest in this rooty soil, in twigs, in cartoon nests, in some special epiphytes, even inside of them, and it didn't really care. But then there are some other species who are like strictly specialized, and that's one of the reasons how probably these ants can coexist in a piece of tropical rainforest, because they utilize different nesting resources.
Well, very good. Petr, I've asked you like 8 million questions about every area of ants, and you handled it well. What's the best way for people to find out more about your work? I want to First, I want to tell people I haven't mentioned it before, but the English way of saying your name is Petr Klimes, Petrklimes, and I'm trying to say it the right way, Petr Klimes. So when people hear it on the podcast, just so they can find you, I wanted to make it easier. But how can they find you and your work? Where can they go?
So I'm managing actually our lab webpage, which is just quite easy to find because it's called antscience.com. And this antscience is like together, like a single word. So if you type antscience.com, you find the page about my laboratory and all the people involved. And we put there, like papers we published and people who work there and some photos and so on. And we are also running some web page of photos of New Guinea ants, which is called, it's like newguineans.org. Again, the New Guinea ants is like together, like a single word. So in these two web pages, they can find actually quite a lot of, not only about me, but about like our work.
Very good. Well, Petr, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, not at all. I'm really happy to give interview and thank you for your interest in our research.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.